Maggie Lawson thought she had it all: the lavish penthouse in downtown New York, private jets and dinners at exclusive restaurants. Her life seemed like a dream come true. And then, just when she thought she'd found her happily ever after, it all came crashing down. Her husband, Walter Brandt, a 60-year-old self-made billionaire, was dead. But his death wasn't just any death. It was cold, calculated, and shrouded in mystery. The world had no idea that the man Maggie had loved and trusted for so long harbored a past so dark it could destroy everything she'd worked for. One quiet autumn evening, Walter was found slumped over his desk, a single gunshot wound to his head. The penthouse was locked from the inside. No forced entry, no fingerprints on the weapon. It looked like an execution. No one could figure out who'd pulled the trigger, not even Maggie. What happened to the man who seemed untouchable? And what would Maggie do now that the secrets of his past threatened to tear apart everything she had? Welcome to the True Crime Journal HQ. If you are new here, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this. For my existing subscribers, I thank you all for being loyal to me. Maggie Lawson had always been driven. Growing up in a small town, she knew what it meant to struggle. Her parents, both hard-working and honest, gave her everything they could, but they couldn't give her the life Maggie longed for. She dreamt of more, of luxury, of success, of escaping the confines of a life defined by limitations. Her ambition burned brightly, a constant reminder that settling was never an option. Maggie believed that if she wanted something, she had to go after it, no matter the cost. By the time she moved to New York, Maggie had built a successful career for herself in public relations, working with high-profile clients and attending exclusive events. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Yet, despite her accomplishments, something was still missing. She craved the kind of life that only came with power, true, undeniable influence. And then she met Walter Brandt. Walter was the kind of man who made people pause, take a second look, and wonder how someone so enigmatic could exist. At 60, he was self-made and incredibly powerful, the kind of man whose name carried weight in both the business world and social circles. He had built his fortune from the ground up: real estate, technology, and various investments that made him one of the wealthiest men in the country. But more than just wealth, Walter radiated a quiet confidence that was almost magnetic. He didn't flaunt his money or success. In fact, he kept much of his life behind closed doors, making his every word and gesture seem purposeful. Maggie wasn't looking for love when she first met him. She was focused on her career, on building her own future. But Walter intrigued her in a way no one else ever had. Their first few encounters were casual, conversations that lingered long into the night, discussing everything from business strategies to life's biggest questions. With each passing conversation, Maggie felt more connected to Walter. There was an intensity about him, a deep understanding of ambition, success, and drive that mirrored her own. Their bond quickly turned into something more. What started as mutual respect blossomed into a whirlwind romance. Within a year, Maggie found herself living in his penthouse, surrounded by the kind of luxury she had always dreamed of. It was a life she could never have imagined in her small-town beginnings: private jets to exclusive vacations, dinners with the city's most influential figures, and a constant stream of lavish gifts and attention from Walter. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, there were signs of tension, subtle cracks that Maggie didn't fully notice at first. Walter's charm and quiet confidence were irresistible, but they began to feel controlling. Maggie, too caught up in the luxury of it all, brushed aside the minor red flags. After all, what did it matter? She had the life she wanted, the future she'd always dreamed of. Yet, as time passed, Maggie began to realize that there was more to Walter than the charming billionaire she had fallen for. At first, it was subtle, small gestures that Maggie brushed off as a product of Walter's overwhelming success. After all, a man with so much power and influence would naturally want to keep tabs on the people around him, right? But as the months went by, Maggie began to notice things that didn't sit well with her. Walter's affection, once generous and free-flowing, started to feel more like a constant check on her behavior. He would text her during meetings, asking where she was or who she was with. It wasn't out of genuine concern, but out of a need to know, to control. At first, Maggie dismissed it as Walter being protective. After all, wasn't that normal for someone who had so much at stake? But soon his requests turned into demands. If Maggie was out for a late dinner with friends, Walter would question her about every detail. Where was she sitting? Who was she talking to? What were they discussing? It wasn't just the small, intrusive questions. It was the way he would cancel plans at the last minute, expecting her to drop everything to be with him, even though she had other commitments. The isolation became more pronounced. Walter would create situations where Maggie had no choice but to prioritize him over everything else. The luxury, the glamour of it all, began to feel more like a gilded cage. Maggie began to doubt herself. Was she overreacting? Was she reading too much into the situation? She had never experienced anything like this before, and a part of her still wanted to believe that this was just the price of a life so far removed from the ordinary. But deep down, the unease wouldn't go away. It lingered, nagging at her whenever she was alone with her thoughts. The unease only deepened when Maggie began to hear whispers about Walter's first wife, Claire. She had always been aware of Claire's death, but had never pressed Walter about it. After all, it seemed like a painful subject for him, and he had never been the type to openly discuss his past. But as Maggie's suspicions about Walter's behavior grew, so did her curiosity about Claire's death. At first, the rumors were small. Casual comments at social gatherings, hushed voices that spoke of a tragic accident. Claire had died in a fall from the penthouse balcony, the kind of death that could be easily explained away. But there were cracks in the story too. Why had no one ever questioned the circumstances of her fall? Why had Walter seemed so unaffected by her passing, moving on to Maggie so quickly? The whispers didn't stop at the accident. There were murmurs of something more, talk of Claire having been on the verge of divorcing Walter, of financial troubles that had plagued their marriage. As Maggie continued to listen, her suspicions began to take shape. Was Walter involved in Claire's death? Could he have been the one who pushed her to her tragic end, just to inherit everything she had? Maggie tried to push these thoughts away, but they kept returning, stronger each time. The life she had with Walter, the life she had always wanted, now felt fragile, as though it could shatter at any moment. Maggie couldn't ignore the mounting tension between her desire for success and the growing suspicion that Walter's charming facade was hiding something darker. Could her ambition, her dreams of luxury and power, be blinding her to the truth? Was she willing to turn a blind eye to something this dark, just to hold on to the life she had built? Her internal conflict became unbearable. She wanted to believe in Walter's love, in the promise of the life he'd given her. But the truth, the one she couldn't ignore anymore, was that there was something dangerous lurking beneath the surface of their perfect life. Maggie didn't know what the truth was yet, but she could feel it in her bones. The deeper she dug, the more unsettling the answers would become. When Maggie finally decided to hire a private investigator, it was a decision born of desperation. She had reached the breaking point, torn between the life Walter had given her and the haunting questions about his past. The investigator she hired was a man named Thomas Caldwell, a seasoned professional who had built a reputation for uncovering the most elusive truths. He wasn't cheap, but Maggie felt there was no other option. If she was going to live in this gilded world of luxury, she needed to know what lay beneath the surface. Thomas had access to resources Maggie didn't, contacts, documents, and connections that could unearth the truth about Claire's mysterious death. The first thing he did was focus on the timeline surrounding Claire's fatal fall. It had always been labeled an accidental death, but Caldwell wasn't so easily convinced. He dug into the financials, scouring Walter's bank accounts and business transactions for anything out of the ordinary. What he uncovered was far more shocking than Maggie could have ever imagined. There were large, unexplained withdrawals from Walter's accounts, timed just before Claire's death. The payments, which Walter had dismissed as routine business expenses, were anything but. They led back to a series of offshore accounts that had been set up only months before Claire's death. The amounts were staggering, large enough to raise suspicion, but small enough to go unnoticed in a life filled with wealth and luxury. Even more disturbing were the patterns Thomas uncovered in Walter's behavior leading up to Claire's death. Maggie had always known Walter to be meticulous and calculating, but now she saw how his every move had been engineered. He had been carefully positioned to inherit everything Claire had, her wealth, her assets, and her influence in the business world. Thomas even found evidence that Claire had been planning to divorce Walter. Her financial records showed she had consulted lawyers about a divorce settlement just days before her fall. The implications were damning. Could Walter have planned Claire's death to secure everything he wanted? The thought gnawed at Maggie. Was it possible that the man she had come to love, this powerful, charismatic figure, was the same man who had orchestrated the death of his wife for money and power? Maggie was horrified, but a part of her wanted to deny it. She found herself questioning everything she had believed about Walter. Could he truly be capable of something so monstrous? Or had she allowed herself to become so entangled in his world of wealth and success that she could no longer see the man she had once admired so deeply? Her emotions were torn between the desire for the truth and the fear of what that truth might mean. Maggie had invested so much in this life, in Walter. To face the reality of his potential guilt would mean the loss of everything she had come to love. Could she really live with that? Could she face the possibility that Walter, the man who had given her everything, was capable of murder? Her mind raced, but the more she thought about it, the clearer the reality became. If she didn't face the truth, she might continue living a lie that would eventually destroy her. But facing the truth meant confronting a horror she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. Could Walter really be the monster the whispers suggested? Or had Maggie allowed herself to fall too deeply into a world of lies? It was a cold autumn evening when the news of Walter Brandt's death reached Maggie. She had spent the day in meetings, her mind still tangled with the unsettling discoveries from Thomas, the private investigator. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, questions about Walter, Claire, and the dark secrets buried beneath the surface. But nothing could have prepared her for the call that shattered her world. Walter was dead. His body had been discovered by his butler, slumped over his desk in the penthouse that once felt like a sanctuary. The scene was disturbingly quiet, almost too perfect. There were no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. Walter's body was still, his head resting at an unnatural angle, a single gunshot wound to the temple. It was as though someone had carefully positioned him, leaving no trace of the violence that had occurred. His desk was undisturbed, the room locked from the inside with no signs of anyone having entered or left. The police arrived swiftly, but they were baffled. The penthouse, which was supposed to be a fortress of wealth and security, offered no answers. The weapon, a sleek, untraceable pistol, was found on the floor beside him with no fingerprints. No clues. It appeared to be an execution-style murder, planned and precise. But who could have done it? And why? Maggie couldn't comprehend it. Her world had just been turned upside down. Walter, the man she thought she knew, had been murdered in cold blood, and she was left reeling in a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. But as the investigation began, it quickly became clear that Maggie was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a suspect. The police had their reasons. Maggie had been the last person to have a confrontation with Walter. She had confronted him about the investigator's findings, about Claire's death, about the money, about the secrets. And now here she was, facing questions from detectives who seemed more interested in her than in finding the truth. Her emotions were a blur: panic, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of terror. The man she had loved, the man who had given her everything, was dead. And now the very same man was haunting her, even in his death. Could she have done it? Could she have killed him in some blind fit of rage after discovering the truth about Claire's death? The idea was unfathomable to Maggie. She had no reason to want Walter dead, at least she told herself that. But the doubt gnawed at her. What if she had been too angry, too consumed with the knowledge of his dark past to see clearly? Or was someone else involved? Someone from Walter's past? Someone who had a much deeper grudge? The weight of the situation was suffocating. The media had already begun to latch onto the story, turning Maggie into the villain in a drama that was only just beginning. She was now the woman caught between the love she had once felt for her husband and the undeniable truth that his life had been entangled in mystery, lies, and possible murder. Could she live with the knowledge that Walter's death might be tied to his past? Could she ever find peace, knowing she might never fully understand the truth? And, most terrifying of all, was she truly guilty, or had she been swept into a world she couldn't escape? The investigation into Walter's death moved quickly, but it was anything but straightforward. Detective Rachel Grant, a seasoned investigator with a no-nonsense attitude, was assigned to the case. She immediately focused on the locked room. There was no sign of a break-in, no fingerprints, and no witnesses. To her, it seemed like the perfect crime. But the deeper she dug, the more contradictions she uncovered. Walter Brandt had always been a man who played his cards close to the chest, but his business dealings were far from the picture of a legitimate, straightforward empire. The more the police uncovered, the clearer it became that Walter had made powerful enemies over the years, enemies who might have been willing to go to extreme lengths to take him down. His real estate empire, which spanned multiple countries, was fraught with shady deals and unspoken alliances. There were reports of partnerships with unscrupulous figures from the underworld, whispers of backroom negotiations, and shady property acquisitions that Walter had never fully disclosed. The sheer scale of his network made it difficult for anyone to pinpoint who might have been responsible for his death. But one thing was clear: Walter had more than a few enemies who would benefit from his demise. As the investigation continued, Maggie found herself in the center of a storm. Detectives and journalists alike circled around her, pulling her in different directions as they sought answers. Maggie, still reeling from the loss, had become a prime suspect in the eyes of the public, and the mounting pressure was unbearable. The media painted her as the grieving wife turned potential killer, her emotional state now under constant scrutiny. But Maggie wasn't prepared for the next wave of revelations. As the investigation delved deeper into Walter's past, a chilling new piece of evidence emerged. A set of documents was found in one of Walter's hidden drawers, buried under a pile of personal correspondence. These documents contained details about Claire's death, details that had never been disclosed to the public. Claire had died after a fall from the penthouse balcony. The official story was that it was an accident, but the documents painted a different picture. Walter had made significant changes to his will just days before Claire's death, altering the terms in her favor. More disturbingly, there was a notarized letter from a lawyer that referenced a heated argument between Walter and Claire. A final straw that may have led to Claire threatening a divorce. There were no signs of foul play at the time, but the suddenness of Walter's fortune shift, coupled with the timing of Claire's death, painted a troubling portrait. The investigator found further evidence, including bank transactions that seemed to link Walter's finances to Claire's death. Large withdrawals from Claire's account had been made shortly before her fall, and, disturbingly, several business assets were transferred into Walter's name within weeks of her death. These new revelations added fuel to the fire of suspicion. Had Walter truly orchestrated Claire's death for the inheritance? Was he willing to kill again to protect his empire? The more Maggie read, the more her worst fears began to materialize. Could the man she had fallen in love with, the man she had trusted implicitly, have been capable of such manipulation, such deceit? The shocking possibility that Walter might have been behind Claire's death made her stomach turn. But there was more, a pattern of controlling behavior, of lies and hidden truths that Maggie could no longer ignore. Could Walter's charm have been nothing more than a carefully constructed facade, masking a darker nature? As Maggie stood at the crossroads of this investigation, she found herself in a precarious position. The new evidence was undeniable, but so was her connection to Walter. She loved him, or had she loved the image of him, the man he allowed her to see? The weight of this internal battle consumed her as much as the external pressure from the authorities. She was no longer just a bystander in this investigation, she was a part of it. And as the truth about Walter's past continued to unfold, Maggie realized that her own future was now tied to the dark legacy of his empire. What did that mean for her? What would she do with the knowledge that Walter's world might have been built on lies, betrayal, and murder? Every shred of evidence led to a deeper hole, a place Maggie wasn't sure she could climb out of. The truth she had been avoiding, the truth she wasn't ready to face, was unraveling faster than she could comprehend. Walter's death was no longer just a tragic loss. It had become a puzzle that Maggie was forced to solve, and in doing so, she was forced to confront the terrifying possibility that everything she thought she knew about Walter and herself was a lie. As the investigation deepened, the answers Maggie had sought only seemed to raise more questions. Walter's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a revelation of a man who had hidden so much beneath his quiet, polished exterior. His business dealings, his enemies, and his relationships all pointed to a complicated web of power, greed, and betrayal. But the more Maggie uncovered, the more the pieces didn't fit together neatly. Walter's death, though tragic, might not have been an isolated event. There was a growing sense that his murder was not just the result of a simple domestic dispute, nor was it a random act of violence. The detectives were now considering the possibility that Walter's past crimes, the ones buried deep beneath his empire, might have finally caught up with him. Could someone from his past, someone he had wronged, have come back to exact revenge? The question lingered in the air unanswered, like a storm on the horizon ready to break. Or perhaps, more chillingly, the motive for Walter's death lay closer to home. Could it have been someone from within his inner circle, someone who had watched Walter manipulate and control for years, finally deciding that they had enough? Was Walter's darkest secret not just his business dealings, but the people who had come to hate him over the years? Maggie, now at the heart of the investigation, couldn't help but wonder, was she too part of a much larger story than she had ever imagined? The possibility that Walter's death was merely the beginning of something far more complicated haunted her. As more information came to light, it became clear that there was still so much about Walter and his past that remained unknown. Was the truth buried too deeply to uncover? And if so, who would be next? The questions kept coming, each one leading to darker paths that Maggie wasn't sure she was ready to follow. But there was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, the world was watching, and Maggie's role in the story was far from over. What do you think happened to Walter Brandt? Was his death a consequence of his past catching up with him, or did someone close to him finally take matters into their own hands? Could Maggie be the key to unlocking the mystery, or is there more to this story than she even realizes? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below with your theories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking twists in this case. There's more to uncover, and you won't want to miss what comes next.